Good afternoon, evening, everyone. My name is David Garza. I am really fortunate to serve as the president and CEO here at Henry Street Settlement. Thank you for, yes, I agree. This is our 133rd year of service to this city and to this community, and we're grateful to welcome you all to our Abrons Arts Center here tonight. It's an exciting time for New York City. It's an exciting night tonight to bring together this really extraordinary group of panelists to talk about something very important. How can big change take place in New York City? And when we think about that, we think of, through Henry Street's 133-year lens, this notion of continuity and change happening at the same time. This notion of a sense of urgency and concern and hope at the same time. They're not mutually exclusive. They inform each other and they create an energy that leads to solutions. We refer to this night, and this is, I believe, maybe it's our 11th or 12th Lillian Wald Symposium. What's the number I'm getting? 12? I got it? 11. It's our 11th Lillian Wald Symposium. Lillian Wald, our founder, who we still champion to this day, made it a very strategic commitment to bring people to the table to talk about neighborhood concerns, but to talk about big challenges and concerns that the community shared, that the city shared, and that we all share as stakeholders. So we're thrilled tonight to have this constellation together here with us tonight. We're here with partners, we're here with community residents. I know we have other settlements in the house. We have United Neighborhood Houses in the house. We have Betances Health Center in the house. We have the panelists that will be introduced shortly. But most importantly, we have you, our community of Lower East Siders and New Yorkers, coming here with us. We bring people to the table to have these very, very important conversations. This symposium is a way to do that. And each year we wrestle with topics that are central to our history and our present day work, just like Lillian Wald did. Tonight's topic is From Affordable Housing to Bike Lanes, How Can Big Change Happen in New York City? The question of affordability and livability is at the top of every New Yorker's minds. With recent data that just come out on the true cost of living in New York City, 62% of New Yorkers cannot afford to live in New York City. 27% of New Yorkers live in poverty. In a neighborhood like ours, there's 59 community districts in New York City. Lower East Side is #1 in income disparity. It's a dubious distinction, but it's one that puts us in a position to look at all possible solutions on how we can make big change happen in the city and for our community. So these goals can seem like pipe dreams sometimes, with statistics like that informing our effort. But our stage tonight is filled with 5 panelists who bring a variety of perspective on how change gets done in New York City. And with that, I am pleased to welcome all of you here tonight to have this conversation with us and to have this opportunity to think together. I also encourage you to stick around after the panel. We're having a reception where the conversation can continue. But at this moment, I'm pleased and grateful to acknowledge probably the most important things that I can do as the president and CEO of Henry Street Settlement, because whenever I get to stand up here behind a microphone and get to introduce myself with that title, I remember one thing all the time, that I'm here to represent the 650 team members that work at Henry Street Settlement day in, day out. So how about a round of applause for the team at Henry Street? And I get to represent and serve the 50,000 individuals that Henry Street serves every year, and the many, many tens of thousands that live here on the Lower East Side and across the city. But to kick us along, I am very pleased to introduce our moderator for tonight, Jessica Yeager. Jessica is the Senior Director of Housing Justice Initiatives at the Center for Justice Innovation. In this role, she supports the center's direct service housing work and also leads its national work, supporting cross-sector partnerships at the intersection of housing, the justice system, and community safety. And it's national work in addition to the direct service work that organization does. So please join me in welcoming Jessica Yeager, our moderator for tonight. Thank you, Jessica. And thank you to all our panelists.
Get the mic. Hi, everybody. Good evening. Thank you so much for having me here today. I'm really excited to be moderating this panel with this amazing group of panelists. You have their bios in front of you, and I encourage you to read them because they are interesting and impressive, and you're going to see the name Williams come up a lot. I will just quickly introduce everyone so we can get right to the talking. So first, I would like to introduce Ann Williams-Isom, a nonprofit executive, attorney, and educator. And Ann also served as the New York City Deputy Mayor for Health and Human Services in the Adams administration. Next to Ann, we have Mason Williams. Mason is the chair of leadership studies and an associate professor of leadership studies and political science at, yes, you guessed it, Williams College. Next, we have Barika Williams, the executive director of the Association for Neighborhood and Housing Development. And then next to Barika, we have Councilmember Chris Marte, who represents District 1, the Lower East Side, this district, in the New York City Council. And finally, we have Norah Yahya, Chief Governmental Affairs Officer at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Thank you so much for being here with us this evening. So we're here tonight to talk about New York City, the best city in the world. And one of the things that makes New York great is that we're always looking to improve. New Yorkers and our elected officials aren't afraid of big ideas. But what makes big change possible? What conditions are necessary? And what big changes could happen in the coming years to address some of our biggest challenges, like the affordability crisis? That's what we're here to discuss today with this amazing panel of experts. We unfortunately won't have time to cover all the important issues, but we will leave time at the end of our discussion for the audience to ask questions. And like David mentioned, there will also be a reception afterwards where the conversation can continue. So first, I'd like to look for a moment at the past. How has big change happened in our history? And Mason, I'd like to start with you. You've studied New York City history and also the science of leadership. I'd like to ask you about your take about how change happens in New York City. What have been some of the biggest innovations in New York over the past eras, and how did they happen?
Well, it's a privilege to be here with this group at this institution. There are some kinds of big change that you can make through politics as usual, but I would like to talk about the kinds of change that make life better for people who don't have much power. And to me, that is a harder lift. It's not always possible. It depends on sometimes certain kinds of windows of political opportunity opening that can be fortuitous. But to me, it involves three factors. One has to do with institutions, a second has to do with interests, and a third has to do with ideas. You need skilled politicians, skilled public officials, people who know how to administer things effectively to make the institutions work in ways that make people's lives better. You also need social movements to organize the interests of disempowered, less powerful people, working people, poor people, in order to change the behavior of elected officials and to change the incentives in the political system. And then behind that, you also need people with fresh ideas for how to make cities work better. So let me just give you one example, since we're here at Henry Street. One of the issues that people were worried about in the early 20th century was public health, because people were living together in this neighborhood in particular at density levels that had never been seen before. Communicable disease is rampant. In the 1930s and 1940s, in the era of the New Deal, there are huge improvements in maternal health, infant health in this neighborhood and in other working class neighborhoods. How did that happen? Well, you have skilled politicians like President Franklin Roosevelt, Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia implementing the New Deal. Part of that involves a new imprint for the city's Department of Health and neighborhoods. But that's happening in part because the labor movement is advancing the interests of disempowered people. And it follows on the heels of 30 years of thinking by people like the social reformers at Henry Street Settlement House and other settlement houses, among others, about how to how to bring collective problem solving to bear on social issues in new ways. So those three things to me need to come together. Those are the prerequisites, and that means everybody's got a role to play in making big change.
Yeah, that's such an interesting point. Sometimes when you read the paper, it can feel like, oh, these things happen quickly, but there's a long history and a lot of different actors involved. And Anne, I'd like to turn to you. You in your career have actually played many of those roles, and I'm interested specifically in during your time when you were in City Hall. You accomplished a lot of change during that period, and it was also a really challenging period. The pandemic, large influx of migrants with profound needs, mental health crisis going on in the city. And yet you were able to make change. You drove change in the space of mental health and Black maternal mortality rates. What made those big ideas succeed, and what caused others to fail? What did you see?
So happy to be here. Also very happy to be here with everyone tonight. I think the only thing my brother Mason said, my brother William, right? Mason Williams said, well, you talked about the sort of the most powerful people being politicians or in government. I don't necessarily think that's true. I actually think the people have the power. Whether or not we use it or not is up to us. And then the concept of people being disempowered or someone has to else empower you, I also don't really think that. I think we walk with our power all the time. And so I just wanted to say that. And so therefore, I think that change happens over time. There are many people who have been in City Hall, many people who have been council people, many people who have been head of institutions, but it's kind of like, what are those missions? What's happening in communities? What do people need? And how can that happen over a period of time? For me, when I first came to government, it was in 1996. 36 years ago, I worked for the Administration for Children's Services. And there were 47,000 children who were in care at that time. And so we can talk about the laws and the policies that changed, but a lot of the change where we are today, where there are 6,000 children who are in foster care, I would say was Black women who were like, why are you kind of taking my kids from me instead of giving me the support that I need to raise my kids carefully and best in the community? And having this whole idea about bringing parents to the table, putting services in communities, that is the undercurrent that brings those big changes around. We talk about homelessness. I was talking to somebody today. We used to have a lot, I know it looks like we have a lot of people who are on the streets who have severe mental illness and who are unhoused. Here in New York City, we have a right to shelter. We have 98% of the unhoused people in New York City are actually sheltered. It's things that we don't really maybe realize, but the progress that we've made, that has happened over many different administrations. So I think that's how big change happens. You pick what are those things, and especially for me as a child and family advocate, those issues around maternal mortality and having doulas, or having, dealing with the opioid crisis, or dealing with all of those issues. Like, there's so many that we have, but I think in different communities, I'm from Harlem, I was raised in Queens, but I'm in Harlem now. How do the people in that community kind of hold their politicians accountable for what needs to get done? And then I would say, let the community-based organizations take the lead in the community.
Yeah, thank you for that. Councilmember Marte, I'd like to turn to you next. So we have a new mayor and a new city council speaker. To get big things done in the city, from your vantage point in the city council, how important is it that those two folks get along and can work together and are aligned? And then also interested to hear from you, what's your biggest idea and how do you think about getting that thing done?
Great. Well, I won't talk about all the drama we've been reading on Politico or in the 6 o'clock news. I really want to touch on the previous administration and how the council worked with former Mayor Adams to actually change a groundbreaking, static education curriculum that we had here in New York City. Mayor Adams created New York City Reads. And so he took on this thing that hasn't moved since 1980s, the way we teach our students and our kids how to read English. It might seem so basic, but what he did was actually use scientific research, use phonetics, and saw what was happening in all across this country in states where they were getting higher test scores than our students, and said, I'm gonna take this on. And he worked with the council to allocate funding to make sure that we have oversight hearings, to make sure that it was working in real time. And I actually got to see it firsthand in our district. At PS 188, where more than a majority of the students are actually unhoused, that's where they put their pilot program of New York City Reads. And the parents and the teachers, they came up to me and they said, my child wouldn't even lift a book. But after he did the New York City Reads pilot program, he loves them. He knows how to sound out the words. He knows what the words mean. Before, he used to just stare blanklessly. And a parent would tell me, I was scared to ask my child, what did that word mean? Because I was afraid of the answer. And that's huge. When you think about New York City Reads and its impact and what it's trying to fix how we teach students with dyslexia. Why is that important? If you look at Rikers Island, 30 to 40% of the inmates there have dyslexia. So this is just not fixing what's happening right now. This is going to have a trickle effect years from now, decades from now, of who gets incarcerated and who doesn't, who has a job opportunity, who doesn't, who gets to excel at life because early on someone was able to learn how to teach them how to read. And so I think that's actually the legacy, and it's a perfect example, even though we had a lot of fights with Mayor Adams, right? Almost every single week it felt like we were battling. But that was a clear example where the council and the administration were in line and we were committed to do this, and we saw results in real time. What are some of my big ideas? I committed this year to really figure out the vacancy issue in public housing. Right now in NYCHA, there's 6,700 units that are vacant. That's insane. When we have a homelessness crisis, where we have affordability crisis, why aren't we tackling this, right? This would immediately be able to open the door, give someone a home, the stability that they need. And it's not a lot of money. You know, when you think about it, it's $40,000 to $60,000 per unit to repair. This is much cheaper than building massive amount of development and housing, new complexes, asking the governor or private developers to do their fair share. This is much cheaper than that, and we can do it much quicker. However, we haven't been able to do it. Each unit takes close to 400 days to be retrofitted to allow a new family to move in. We need to expedite that. We need to make it much shorter. We should make it like a typical market rate unit, which only takes a month or 2 months to make it ready for a turnkey family to move in. And so I made this my priority, not just as a council member on a local level. I made sure that the Progressive Caucus, which I'm a part of, put it on their priority list. I'm the co-chair of the BLAC, the Black, Latino, Asian Caucus. I put it on their priority list. I've spoken to the speaker, made sure that she put me in the Public Housing Committee, so when NYCHA's in front of me, we can ask them the hard questions to make sure that we can figure out how to fix this issue, because it can help thousands, hundreds of thousands of family, and we can do it right now if we had the political will to do it.
Yeah, great examples of how things can actually change when the people that you're working with are aligned. I'd like to turn to you, Norah and Barika, to talk about, from your perch outside of government, what role do players like your organizations play in change? And it's, I think both Anne and Mason talked about, these are often long fights and efforts, and it is the organizations like yours and others that are often at the forefront of making that change. So I'm interested to hear your thoughts and like how, what kinds of wins have your organizations been part of, and how have those wins come about? Who needs to be aligned for that change to happen?
Yeah, first, I'm really honored to be here. I got my start in a career with United Neighborhood Houses as a youth advocate, so this is a really beautiful moment. That said, at the Met, I can say, just thinking about, yes, museums, but also nonprofits altogether, we are what gets the agenda done. You can't be able to do any of that, whether you're the mayor or the speaker or a city council member, without your nonprofit sector. We're the ones who actually implement all of the changes, and we should be better integrated into a part of these policy discussions. So when you think about something like the global pandemic, for example, the Met was able to, because it's a 2 million square foot institution, 5 city blocks, with the new HVAC system, we opened up in 4 months and was able to provide a public space to all New Yorkers at a time where people couldn't leave their homes, right? In addition to that, we were able to provide vaccines on the plaza, and then the next year serve as a polling location. So I think when you think about all of our institutions and locations as partners in getting the agenda completed, then you really are able to drive change in a sustainable way that meets the demand of community. I would also say some of the major wins, I think the City Council and the administration for baseline funding to the Department of Cultural Affairs of $45 million. What does that mean? It means that we don't have to keep doing the budget dance every year, as I know a lot of our CBOs and nonprofit partners do, which is, for those who don't understand, there is money in the budget that is not in the out years. So that means that you have to fight for it every year. Those are the advocacy campaigns. Those are city hall rallies, constantly asking for funding. And what that also means is that someone might not know if they have a job or not until June 30th when the budget is adopted. That's unacceptable. So it's really about trying to eliminate the budget dance and not being used in that way, understanding that these are real lives that are being impacted. And then also, what are we losing by having this budget dance, right? For institutions, they're not able to imagine and dream about what other programs we could do to respond to the need of our communities. Instead, we're focused on trying to keep what we have. And so I think the more that these institutions and nonprofits are integrated into the conversation, the more progress that we could probably make in advancing the agenda of our elected officials.
Thank you, everybody, for having me and for being here. And I just want to build on what other folks have said. Speaking of that budget dance, so I represent more than 85 plus nonprofit organizations across New York City on housing, economic development, small business issues. And we do that budget dance, all of us. So think about the fact that each year, we as a city do not know if we have the nonprofits to provide SCREE, i.e. senior support for rental assistance, DREE, tenant assistance, homeownership counseling. All of these things are year to year, like, let's do this. And it's always this question of like, are we just going to stop doing this next year? So like, why do we spend as nonprofit organizations tons of money to do that could be flowing into actually serving our communities and residents. And I think sort of the meta piece, which Ann and some other folks have just touched on, is this is there are always at least two sides to really pushing and advancing space for change. We as nonprofit organizations are outside of government, and it's okay that part of our job is sometimes to push government, whether it's our elected officials, whether it's the folks in City Hall, whether it's the federal government, what have you. That's part of what we do. And sometimes we're pushing so that you have space to get NYCHA vacancy filled. We should have a whole conversation on that. But sometimes we're pushing, and it's like we're pushing against somebody, and that's part of our job. That's part of our responsibility. And I think sometimes, especially in this environment nationally, there's a labeling that is bad and that's a problem. And actually the answer is no. That's what we're here for. That's how we've gotten many of these massive civil and social justice wins across the country, locally all the way up to federally.
Yeah, thank you. That's such a critical point. And how the budget dance, as you're calling it, really gets in the way of organizations like that you're talking about in achieving their mission, and also gets in the way of the communities that you're talking, that those organizations are working with and serving, getting what they need, and being that movement. So maybe that's a big area for change that someone should pick up and take on. I know people have been working on that for a long time, so we'll all keep working on that. But I would like to keep talking about the budget. So movements and ideas and all the work that goes into making change obviously is critical, but so is the budget. So I want to talk about the relationship between the budget and change, and to consider what's possible right now in our current budgetary situation. So Councilmember Marte, I'd like to start with you. New York City's budget for 2027 is about $127 billion with a B dollars, and we have a budget deficit in the multi-billions. And at the same time, we have big ideas on the table, like free buses and universal health care and a lot more affordable housing. What will it take to get these big ideas done? Is it possible in this budget situation?
It is possible. It all comes down to political will. I mentioned that before, right? We have 127, 25, 23, depending if you're asking the speaker or the mayor, billions of dollars. And so it's a political decision, right? It's like, where should I give this money to? Should I give it to arts and culture? Should I give it to our CBOs? Should I give it to social services? And typically, most politicians, and I gotta say sometimes myself, we tend to give a little bit to everybody, to say that, okay, we can't put out the fire completely, but we want to be supportive and make a minor dent. But I want to give you an example of a politician that actually took a really big political risk, and now we're seeing transformative change around it. He's just across the river, Borough President Antonio Reynoso. Every borough president has $45 million of capital funding. And as I said before, every borough president gives a little bit of everyone, gives it to, and I'm sure our current borough president is going to give a little bit to the Met Museum, the MoMA, give it to public schools to make sure that their auditoriums, cafeterias are fixed. What Antonio did, he said, one of the biggest crises that we have in Brooklyn is maternal health. If you're a Black woman living in Brooklyn, you have a 7 times more likely to die giving birth than a white woman. And he said, no one is really tackling this issue with intention on a capital front from city government. And so what he did was he gave that $45 million to health and hospitals and organizations that were doing work in that space. That was extremely bold. He wasn't doing it for votes, right? If he wanted to do it for votes, he would have been fixing a little bit over here, a little bit over that. He saw a crisis. He knew that it was going to be political backlash, and he had to make those difficult conversations. He had to call every single nonprofit, every single institution and say, you're not getting the funding that you typically have. I'm sorry. I'm trying to meet the moment in this crisis and really try to change how giving birth is done in Brooklyn. And he did that. And I think that's just a perfect example of if you really care about an issue, if you really want to make a change, it takes that political will. And it just doesn't happen because he woke up one day and thought it was an amazing idea. It's because people on the ground have been organizing around him, educating him, taking him to hospitals, taking him to NICUs, showing him the disparities per block by block, neighborhood by neighborhood, showing him the difference between a family being raised in Park Slopes and Canarsie in East New York. And it took decades of work that led to that one moment where he could make a really serious political decision and actually have impact. And I think, when we look at that example and, whether you believe we're in a budget deficit or not, there still has to be decisions made. And it really depends on the political will, right? Do we have the political will to actually tax the rich, to make sure that we're bringing more money to end the homelessness crisis, to make sure that we can have buses that don't take 20 minutes to come on time? And I think there is the groundswell for that, but now we have to make sure that the people who can make the decision are held accountable and make those decisions.
I love that example. Is this on? Hi. Can you guys hear me? I love that example, and what you didn't say was that his wife gave birth in that community. And so he's like, I'm here, I want her to be safe, there are things I can do. Did the 45 million solve the problem? No, but it drew attention, right? Where people were like, oh, what can this money do? And then to have that partnership with health and hospitals, and so that we can see what can we learn there that we could take to other hospitals, I think it's a great idea. And the only thing I wanted to add was that you said the political will, but a budget is a policy document also, right? It's a reflection of policies, and it's a reflection of your priorities. And the truth of the matter is, there is a lot in New York City that people can prioritize. So I'm not sure, and we talked about it, it could be buses, it could be childcare. I could say, for me, I really want to focus on homelessness, I really want to focus on the opioid crisis. But I think it is this idea of how do we make those decisions? How do we prioritize them? And a budgetary document is really a priority policy document.
Well, Anne, let's stick with you.
Okay.
So exactly, and I'm really interested to hear, you were in the seat to have to make those hard decisions. When we can't do it, maybe we could do it all if we tax everyone the way we should. But right, there's hard decisions have to be made.
We could do more.
Hard decisions have to be made, and you've been in a seat where you've had to make them.
Yeah, so what I will just say about that, and just really quickly, is that when we had the new arrivals coming to New York City during what was called the migrant crisis, all of us deputy mayors had to cut budgets. And I think you do that based on, okay, where can I make a cut? What is my priority? I still want to get something new done. And so for me, it was around babies being born into shelter. Could we really say no babies should be born into shelter? And what project would we do in order to really make sure that that doesn't happen anymore? It was about not, making sure that children are not coming into foster care if they don't need to. So can we be doing more family empowerment programs in the community? So I think everybody makes decisions based on your own background. I am a lawyer, I am an educator, all of those things that you say. So I'm gonna lean towards what can we do for mom and children early on. I don't think there's any magic to that. And then we present it to the mayor. We're all kind of competing. All the deputy mayors are around the table competing for a small pot of money and hoping to kind of make an argument about why this investment at this time is an important thing to do. And again, it doesn't mean that you'll never get another bite at the apple, but it means that you're trying to prioritize something at that particular moment.
Yeah. It's really interesting to hear about how this all works behind the scenes. I mean, Chris, is that a similar process in the city council, would you say? Obviously working with many, many more people.
Yeah, so the way it works in the city council is every council member is given $5 million of capital and $1 million or so in discretionary, so programmatic funds. So teach an after school program, or helping our nonprofit partners to bring kids to the museum. And so we internally have to make those decisions. And we're one of the few districts that do participatory budgeting, which allows community members to submit ideas, vote on it, and we allocate $1 million. But we know that $5 or $6 million is not enough to take care of everything we want to take care of. And so we're doing the same thing as former deputy mayor. We're asking the speaker for money. We're saying, hey, speaker, help the Lower East Side, help Chinatown. We have an amazing program that just needs an extra $1 million to open up the doors. Or we need $10,000 more to start this experimental theater class that Sheng Wen wants to do, a local school here. And it's a lot of tug of war, and it's pretty much being the most annoying council member to the speaker, honestly. So then she says, all right, I'm just gonna give you the money, sit down. And then we do the same with the mayor. Once we get the money from the speaker and we're feeling really good, and this is like 2 nights before we vote on the budget, you go to the mayor with your little tin can and you do the same dance, and hopefully you get something from there as well.
It's very interesting. We're getting the inside scoop here. Thank you for that. Mason, I'd like to turn to you and ask, so our new mayor is really great at rallying culture change support. He's a great communicator. But what are the ways that the mayor can actually impact the budget?
Well, you do have to make choices. The traditional way of trying to get around to having to do so, at least to some degree, is to try to figure out some way to partner collaboratively with other levels of government. And I'm not talking about simply asking for money here. I'm talking about the self-interest of other levels of government. So we were talking about those neighborhood health clinics that the New Deal built during the Great Depression. Why were those built? Well, the city wanted them. Did the federal government simply want to give money to New York City? No, there were millions of people out of work during the Great Depression, and that's a problem that the national government has to solve. How to do it? Here, we'll help put people to work on publicly useful projects. That's one example of how you can go about trying to do this. And, we're not going to see a New Deal in all likelihood, but look for opportunities to partner creatively. That's one thing. Another thing that just occurs to me as a student of history is that it's extraordinarily important to be fiscally responsible. The city can get into some really, really dire straits when we're ignoring the need to make hard choices. But I also want to point out that it can be expensive in the long run not to spend money. Councilmember Marte's example is a very good one, right? It's expensive not to have effective early childhood education. It's extraordinarily expensive to use Rikers Island as your #1 mental health facility. Housing insecurity is hugely expensive in the long run. So we need to bear those things in mind too as we're thinking about the budget and what it means to spend in the city.
Yeah, it's the difference between short-term and long-term interests seems implicated in what you're saying, and I just don't know if any of you, how do we make it so that government is more focused perhaps on those long-term outcomes? Anyone have an idea about that? I just wonder, how do we move at least in that direction? It's often forgotten.
I have an No, I'm just talking too much. I think the reason they don't is because a politician wants to take credit for it himself or herself, right? So that's why nobody's looking to be like, oh, I'm going to start this and then it'll happen in 12 years, and right? So I think part of that is, can we get rid of the self-interest of the person who's sitting in those seats right now and really say, I'm going to do this for the long?
Which is why it's so important what you said earlier, which is that politicians are ultimately not the most powerful people. They need to be held responsible in precisely those kinds of ways. Yeah.
I will also say, I think Ann and Chris kind of buried something in there, and I'm not normally the one to like lift up politicians on a panel as like an outside advocate, but I do think it's like a really important piece, which especially in this moment in time nationally, who is in those rooms matter a lot. Like, yes, we believe in building community power, and so that rests with people power, but also who are in those seats, what they are speaking to, and how they are pushing for you is a huge deal. And so Anne Marie's like, talking about being in a seat and saying, no, maternal health is a critical issue. Antonio, when you're like, no, I want to talk about vacancies. I want to talk about homelessness. And that comes into the short and long term, because whether or not your community, your identity, your issues are being addressed, both short and long term, especially the long term, is very heavily tied to whether or not somebody sitting in that seat understands and recognizes the long-term value, right? The number of times where people are like, oh, art, no. It's not, oh, art, right? Like, and that probably comes from somebody who maybe doesn't have the lived experience of how transformative, how impactful, how educational, how economic opportunity that art can have in people's lives for not just a person, but a community. But if that's not your orientation, then you're going to be like, yeah, arts organizations, like, let's give them $100 and we're going to do this, all this, right? And this is what I feel like we run into. And so sometimes we say it in an oversimplified way of like representation matters, but it does matter. It's not just about identity, it's also about what experiences, what values, and therefore what policies and resources are being lifted up in those rooms and ultimately being supported.
Yeah, thank you, Barika. And also that accountability. Yeah. Mason, just one last question for you on this topic. So just interested, in the past, since you've studied our history, the history of the city, have major changes in the city been connected to budget challenges ever? Or are they always tied to budget boons? Like, is it possible to make big improvements and innovations when there's challenges in the budget?
It is possible. I mean, there are innovations that come out of the fiscal crisis of the 1970s. We tend to think of kind of public-private partnerships as being driven by the big, property interests and so forth in the city. Actually, a lot of them start as community initiatives. What's that? Yeah, community gardens, perfect example. Even sort of business improvement districts, which are now big sort of Manhattan, big business kind of things, start in the outer boroughs as an effort just to provide services that the city is not. You don't want to go too far and kind of valorize that, because the risk is that, your public-private model on the one hand is that the High Line has its 9 full-time gardeners, and the neighborhood gardens maybe don't quite get the same resources over the long run. So you need to be careful about those sorts of things, right?
Yeah, you don't want to outsource all of that. But yeah, so it is possible, though, to be that the times when there are challenges can create new creative ideas about how to get things done. Sounds like what.
Yeah, I think you look for opportunities for creative community level mobilization, and then once the resources are available, again, it's really, I agree very much that it's very important to support communities in their own uplift.
Anne.
Child tax credits during COVID, right? Right now in New York City, 1 in 4 children are living in poverty, and I think we were able to get I don't know, how many millions of children off of, no longer in poverty, but we decided to go back to the status quo after COVID. So that was a choice, when we know that if you just give people money and trust parents to use it in the way that they need to, that it can make a very big difference. So that's an example of something that came out of a tragedy that could have been good, but then the government decided not to continue it.
Very apt and depressing example. But perfect segue to talk now about affordability. Everyone's favorite topic, affordability. So Barika, we've known each other a long time. You describe yourself as a dreamer and a pragmatist, and I'm interested to hear from you. As you think about housing policy in New York City, what does the dreamer want to see, and what does the pragmatist hope to see in the coming few years?
Yes. So I think the dreamer side, you have to be a dreamer if you're working on housing, I think, quite honestly. It is a very slow, steady, sobering sector. We don't often have huge, massive changes in the course of a year. We work on campaigns that run 5 to 10 years pretty consistently. And I think the dreamer side is everybody is talking about this. We even in New York City have been talking about this for a long time, but everybody across the country is now talking about housing very differently. And understanding that what it costs to live, just to have a roof over your head, whether you are a renter or a homeowner, is running away from most people in the United States. And it has long been running away from most people here in New York City, right? And so I think, first of all, kudos to all of us sitting in this room, because we're New Yorkers. And being a New Yorker who lives here, you're already being a little bit of a dreamer, whether you want to or not. So welcome to the club. We are all in it. But that's a little bit, but then the pragmatist is and we have to do the steps to start to solve this, right? And saying we want to bring all these vacant units in NYCHA online is both practical and a big dream, because you're doing it in the moment in time where big dreams, federal government isn't coming back in and funding NYCHA. That's not going to happen. That's my big, big dream, which isn't even a huge dream. Pay for the thing that you created is not a massive dream, but that is a huge federal housing dream right now. But there are some really exciting big things that are being discussed around community ownership, around really thinking about a different lens and a different look at affordability as tied to incomes and what people can actually afford versus what they're paying in rents, and how much that is getting out of whack for a lot of us. And the pragmatist side is this is going to be slow work. It's going to be slow and painful work. And so the first thing I would say on behalf of all of us is it doesn't help anybody's life tomorrow, but the answer is a little bit of patience, right? The way that we get out of this affordable housing crisis is step by step, bit by bit, unit by unit, rent by rent. There is no and tomorrow we will have 30,000 of these, and they will all be renting for 1,000 units, and they will all be in your district. That's not a thing. It's not coming. It's not in any of our back pockets. We don't have it, right? So I think there's the pragmatist side of me is what can we do practically with this new administration, with a new opportunity to say, we can try to actually make real changes in people's lives. How much, a lot of us are spending 30% of our income on rent or mortgages, including utilities and housing. So how to make a dent in that so that people can actually breathe and pay for groceries and pay for healthcare and pay for a music class and whatever that is, while also not losing sight of the big picture dream is to actually really change the framework for this here in New York City and across the country. Because otherwise, folks, and some of you will say we're already there, but New York will look even more different 25 years from now than it will right now. And none of us want this beautiful space to not be able to exist in the future because it's like deemed not maximizing profit, right? That's where a lot of the conversations sometimes situate around. And New York City shouldn't be a place that's only for rich, wealthy folks who can afford $6,000 plus a month rents. That's unrealistic. And we won't be able to operate as a city like that, just to also be clear. My favorite stat for like sobering this, biggest employer of NYCHA, Department of Education. So just think about where will your teachers be, right? Where will our civic employees be if we don't actually start to bend the corner of we're already exporting tons of our artist community outside of New York City because they can't afford here. And that's been a central part of New York's culture for ages. So really thinking about that. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, you said a lot in there. There's so much. Thank you, Barika. I mean, one thing that the relationship between the pragmatist and the dreamer, I think, is a really important point. Sometimes it goes in the wrong direction, like we've seen with NYCHA and federal support, but also, the ideas that are now realistic were dreams, right? A state Section 8 program, good cause, eviction protection, some of the big wins that you have been part of, achieving. So,
good right to counsel was
another big
10, 12-year fight. Permanent affordability was a 15-year fight. And in both of those, I can say for a fact, we were laughed out the room when we first talked about them.
Yeah, exactly. It's a long fight. I'd like to stick with you for one moment to talk about the rent freeze. Major part of the mayor's campaign platform, and is something that it looks like it's going to happen. That there will be a rent free. There may be a rent freeze for the about 1 million units that are rent stabilized in New York City. And that makes a lot of sense because we know how much renters are struggling. And at the same time, there's been criticism of the policy because of what it might mean for having a blanket policy like that being applied to so many units and what that could mean for maintenance of those buildings. And I know in your organization, you work with a large number of the nonprofit affordable housing providers who will be impacted by this policy. So I'm just interested to hear, what you think about that, what the impacts might be, and what the city should be thinking about if it does go into effect about how to mitigate any harm that might happen.
Yep. So I'm with Jessie. I think the rent freeze is likely going to happen, is what I would say. I think so. My membership is literally, I have members on both sides of this. Folks who are operating and managing your affordable housing buildings in your neighborhoods and communities, including right here, and folks who are the community organizers who are like, we want a rent freeze, who are the folks who we went from a single Manhattan-based rent guidelines board meeting to a multi-borough requirement for rent guidelines board because of the organizing and advocacy work of these members. So it's like, I got kind of both sides of the shop. The truth is, not carrying water for anybody, it is more expensive to operate a building in New York City. The cost of this is changing. That's the reality. And the cost of this is changing across the country. Think about inflation, think about what it costs to get a new boiler, think about a huge one, this is gonna sound weird, insurance. Insurance is tripling for some people year to year, okay? And for my members, they're running affordable housing units. So they're keeping their rents low, they're restricted by government, they want to do this, and they have rules about how much they're supposed to spend on X, Y, and Z, and nobody pay 3 times more every single year in those structures and deals, right? But at the same time, what I love about my membership is we're also often the community caretakers. Talk about the Met. I got my COVID shot in an ANHD member organization. Like, they opened their doors. They were like, here's a food service. I see Riseborough's food delivery truck come through my neighborhood all the time. So they also know these families. And they're like, but I also know this family doesn't have any more money. Right? And so I think fundamentally we have to ask some really tough questions. And part of what's coming up in the rent freeze is costs may be rising for building owners, but we can't balance the books on people who don't have more. That is not an option. We can't say, well, then the answer has to be that people who are already paying more than they can afford in order to be able to just exist in New York City have to pick up that tab, right? And importantly, for a very particular audience of landlords, that's not about picking up the tab to make sure the building operates. For some people, that's about picking up the tab to make sure they get a certain level of profit. And those are very different things. And we as government should not be responsible for making sure you get a certain return for your investors. We're about making sure that long-term conversation about, hey, if all these people have to leave, we're picking up this bill because they're in homeless shelters, they're in ERs, the students' grades are dropping, right? We now have a whole community of students who are now living unhoused, and that costs us money as a city. So now we're paying double, right? So I think we've got to be realistic about the balance of this. And so for our members, we're like, we're going to have to figure out some of the issues around the cost of accounting for a rent freeze and not seeing that increase in rents, but we're not trying to squeeze, what's that phrase? Lemons for the lemonade, whatever that thing is. I can't do that. Right? But we can't ask people to do more than, and they can't do it. And it's not helpful for any of us to like break our own communities because my members are literally in the neighborhoods. And that's not helpful. So.
Yeah. Thank you, Barika. Yeah, lemon from a stone. Or yeah, that's not right either. But it's a really complicated issue. It's a really complicated issue, and you just really covered the different facets of it. Norah, I'd like to turn to you and ask you about how the affordability crisis in the city impacts the arts sector, and what types of affordability initiatives would be most helpful to folks who are in the arts, specifically thinking about the diversity of artists in the city.
Yeah. I think Barika hit a lot of this. Thank you. Also, just right now, we're in a moment where there's a big question about housing and how to close the gap between the elite consumer and the struggling artists. And I think that's been acceptable for so long, right? And now we're at a point where people no longer live in this city. And what does that mean for the vibrancy and the culture of this city? So I think it's really thinking about the cultural ecosystem. It's not so much just this institution or this artist housing, but oftentimes a lot of our struggling artists work for the city. You know, to your point with DOE, they are your lifeguards. They're your census worker. They are finding whatever government gig they can find to make ends meet while they're also trying to follow their dream as struggling artists. And so I think it's really about how do we develop a system that supports them holistically and isn't just concerned about one angle of artistry. And then there's a real crisis I see in the future because do you just want, elite consumers in our institutions in which you pay your tax dollars towards? No. So how do we fix that, right? And so I think some of the initiatives, I can say the Met Museum, for example, we are owned by the city. Our plaza is owned by the Parks Department. The building is owned by the Department of Cultural Affairs. That means that your taxes are already going into our institution. And we are pay as you wish every day that we are open. So if you feel like paying a penny, you can pay a penny. If you want to give us $5, thank you. And that's really important for New Yorkers and how to sustain that. And so thinking about it in that ways, what are other systems and tools that the city can invest in to make sure that we continue to be accessible because it is so life-changing and impactful to have arts in this city? And what would this city be without artists and without our institutions? I don't know if we'd really want to live here. I think we take it for granted oftentimes that you can take a dance class at Henry Street or you can take a dance class at Alvin Ailey, get on the train. We have access to so much, and it's really not seen as a necessity oftentimes by city government. It's seen as a nice to have because arts and culture is not a mandated service in the city budget, as we were talking about. We get the competition that we're up against, but oftentimes that means that a lot of these social services get cut pretty drastically because it's some of the only areas that they can cut, right? So you think about our library systems, you think about our cultural institutions, childcare services, they get decimated when we have hard years. And what does that mean for the ecosystem of the city? So I think we would look to really find initiatives that can support us. When we talk about diversity in particular, something the Met started is a NYCHA internship program. We have one of the most competitive internship programs, like applying to Harvard. It's insane. I've never seen anything like it. And we realized like this is a pipeline issue, right? Who's applying? Who's aware of it? What's marketing like? How are these people having access to these internship programs? Let's have a designated pipeline for NYCHA students to be able to come to the Met Museum, have this experience, and carry that on their resume too. When we think about who's majoring in art history, it's one-dimensional. So how do we change that trajectory so that we can continue to have diversity in leadership? I can say I spearheaded alongside with our chief diversity officer and someone in the room, our former head of comms, the NYCHA internship program. I know how impactful that is as someone who grew up, who depended on these sorts of programs. If I wasn't in that room, that program wouldn't exist. So I think it's so important for us to continue to think about diversity, yes, from a demographic perspective, but also from an experiential perspective, from a lived experience. What has that been? What does that look like? So then you can have a more robust way of responding to the needs of community. And then finally, I would say thinking about how we continue to get strategic in times of strife as far as the budget is related is how do you depend on these public institutions? We're a public palace, right? How can we partner? How can we be a better third space for youth? How can we be a better center for our seniors, making sure, especially for our isolated seniors, we have something called the Art Box where we work with Meals on Wheels to provide arts programmings and meeting them where they are, especially for our isolated seniors. So what are all the ways in which we can find this integration to make sure that we're supporting New Yorkers?
It's great to hear about. Thank you. Councilmember, I'd like to turn to you to talk about transportation affordability. I know you're an avid cyclist, and a lot of the changes that have happened, like some of the big changes that have happened in the city in the last number of years, has been around biking infrastructure and pedestrian use of spaces and things like that. Sometimes these improvements are critiqued as being sort of for the elite. And not necessarily reaching, as city bike expands, et cetera, reaching, the diversity of the city, the large scope of the city. I'm just wondering how you think about balancing transportation needs to make sure that that access is spread out.
Yeah, I think even growing up in the Lower East Side, when I saw that they put in a bike lane on Rivington Street, I said that's not for me. And you see this all across the city in many communities. Once they put that hermit green paint on the ground, you say, oh no, they're coming from my neighborhood. It's like they're creating a pathway for gentrifiers to come in. And because right now in our city, cycling is not affordable. Like unless you can buy your own bike and find storage for it or lock it and pray that someone doesn't take it, our public bike infrastructure, which is mostly dependent on City Bike, is $250 a year. And if you choose to use the e-bike, I commuted from my office, which is a 15-minute walk, to here today. And I took the silver City Bike. It cost me $2.50. It's more expensive to ride a City Bike than any other form of transportation in our city. And as government officials, as we allow for City Bike to grow to the outer boroughs, it shouldn't be government choosing which neighborhoods to gentrify. We should take ownership that this is public infrastructure, that we're allowing private sector to come to our public spaces and our row, and we should force them to do more for our communities. Yes, because of this push, City Bike subsidizes folks who live in public housing, but it has to go much further than that. And I'm carrying two legislation, and my comrade from Brooklyn, Lincoln Ressler, who's an avid cyclist, is carrying another legislation where we're demanding City Bike to subsidize for certain types of people. I have a bill for older adults. I'm introducing a bill, I think tomorrow, for CUNY students, because if people realize that they can bike, that the bike lanes are for them, that's gonna change how we cycle, how we commute, and how we gather as a city. And right now it feels like the most vulnerable are being left behind physically. And so, we have to use government to put more pressure on private institutions, especially if we're giving them free land and free space, technically.
That's a really good point.
And Mason, just as we get close to the end here, I'm just interested to hear if you can give us some historical context about the affordability challenges in the city, where this all has come from.
I'll be quick. It's a very straightforward question. Well, when you're talking about affordability, you're talking about two sides of a ledger, and it's important to keep that in mind. You're talking about what you have to pay for what you need, and you're talking about what you have in order to pay for what it is you need. So it's always been expensive to live in New York, but in the mid-20th century, say into the 1960s, it's less expensive than it is now. Why is that? Because we had a working class in the city that was relatively well off compared to the rest of the country. That's a story about labor unions. And there's more to it than that, but I think sociologists think nationwide of the increase in inequality since the 70s, about a third of it's explained by the decline of labor unions. At the same time, because working class incomes are relatively high, they're high enough to induce the development of new mass market housing. A little bit easier to do that when you're building up new neighborhoods in Queens and on Staten Island and so forth. In the 1970s, that's when you get deindustrialization. That's when you see the decline of working class income stagnation, and they never really recover. And so by the 80s, what you're looking at, for a bunch of complicated reasons, is that you no longer have mass sort of rental power that's enough to induce new development, especially close to subway lines and stuff like that. In the 1990s, you get another piece, which is changes in the rent stabilization laws, which allow you to go to market rate if you can get above, initially, it's $2,000 in rent. What happens as a consequence of that, as you get all of this growth of the professional managerial class, instead of building new housing to accommodate that market, you push out established tenants, and you can effectively do redevelopment by recycling housing that had been working class housing for people who can pay more for it. That's the gentrification story that proceeds through the Bloomberg years. So what are we really talking about here when we're talking about the affordability crisis? We're talking about the fact that working class jobs no longer pay people what they need for all sorts of things, right? And we shouldn't just get caught up on the cost of housing and lose sight of that fact, because it's really good jobs are really important for housing affordability, for food affordability, for childcare affordability, for everything, right? That's great. And that's one of the things that gets traded off as a consequence of the rental crisis, right? There's really good, CSS, I think, has really good statistics on just what people were foregoing in terms of, again, expensive to be poor, right? So that's one thing. But then the declining, the fact that it's no longer economical to build new housing in the city for, a general kind of rental market, mass rental market, means the government has a new role to play there. And at precisely this moment, the government is spending less on affordable housing construction, despite some, pretty ambitious plans by the city under Koch and Bloomberg and Dinkins in particular in terms of affordability. But that's what it is, right? Government has more of a role to play. We could talk about various ways to kind of change regulations to induce that, but nonetheless, government's going to have a role to play in terms of new affordability construction. This came up in what Barika was saying, we're still kind of dealing with the fallout of the speculative frenzy for, there are people who actually do need some help, meeting the costs of providing housing, but a lot of people are just still not getting the profits that they bought in this speculative market. And so it's keeping that, the eye on that ball is really important too. But then, we need to be thinking about how to create jobs for working people that will allow them to pay the bills.
That's a great note to end on. Okay, we have a lightning round, and then we're going to open it up to questions. So start thinking about your questions for these folks. Okay, we got 6 minutes. Mayor Mamdani has rolled out an ambitious agenda that we've been talking about. Where do you think he has the best chance of success, and why? So that, thinking about affordable housing, free buses, free childcare, or anything else that you want to talk about. And I will start with you, Anne.
You started Don't start with me. Don't start with me. I don't know. You know why? Because it's hard for me to just think about those three isolated things. And I think it's based on what you said. Like in the midst of, he'll focus on those things, but people, I told you I just became a grandmother 8 months ago. So when I'm thinking about Noelle, I'm not, thank you. I know I look so young. Thank you very much. When I'm thinking about her, I'm not like, oh, she just needs diapers. Oh, she just needs a safe place to live. Oh, she needs a good education. I'm like, she needs diapers. She needs a safe place. Who's taking care of her? What school? What medicine? What this? And I just want to keep on. This is why I love Henry Street and settlement houses and the Harlem Children's Zone. I want to talk about it all. I want to talk about what do I want for my children, my families? What do I want here? And it's not one thing. So I think he's going to do a good job on those things because I think he's going to have the political will and he's going to work with the city council. But I want to keep on talking about what are all the things that I want for my children and my grandchildren and not have to say I have to have childcare and not a good doctor and I have to have a good playground, but not this other thing. So that's my lightning round answer.
I'm a historian. I'm still trying to learn what did happen, and you're asking me about what's going to happen?
That's right.
Sounded like the rent freeze? Is that-
I'm like, neither one of them exactly answered, so I feel like I shouldn't answer.
Come on, guys.
But okay. I'm gonna say rent freeze and the grocery stores. And I loved this social media response. Somebody, I think, tweeted or something in response to like someone somewhere losing their mind over the idea of like subsidized grocery stores. And then somebody was like, you know that like these are these things, like they were like they'd like listed out like what the different things are, like subsidized eggs, this and this, and then it's like it's called a commissary. Like we do these already as a part of government. So I feel like those are the two, I think.
Yeah, I think last night changed my answer when the governor announced the pied-à-terre tax. That's a form of taxing the rich. And for her to go about face when for years she's been against it, where our current borough president, I think, left the state senate because he couldn't get it through, for her to make this one of her big policy pushes at the end of the budget shows that he's already seceding in that.
Pied-à-terre tax says that you have a higher tax rate on your second home if it is over $5 million, and naming that it's called the pied-à-terre tax because it already exists in France. Also a thing where it's like, not the end of the world.
Thank you.
I'm gonna say childcare for my own personal interest. I have a 3-year-old and it is impossible. I don't know why childcare ends at 3 o'clock when we don't get out of work till 5. Like this doesn't make.
Right here.
Your mic's not working either.
If you want to stand up and speak to the audience, I'm sure people will hear you.
Yeah, so I have 2 questions. The first one is for you, Norah. With city budget pressures, how can smaller theaters and art centers survive while larger institutions often get more attention and funding? And my second question is for you, Mr. Marte, and for Barika Williams. Can New York City still call itself a cultural capital if artists, art workers, and younger residents can no longer afford to live here?
Okay, I can project. I'm a heritage child, so I do totally agree with you. I think it's a real concern, especially when we think about models. I think government has to be responsive that we are not all created equal. So when you think about our theaters, their revenue model is very different than a museum. When you think about all the performing arts centers, right? They can't become free to all because that's how they receive their revenue to exist. So what does subsidized programming look like? for those institutions, and how do we uplift them? How do we make sure that we are investing in them in a way that feels equitable, without also then destabilizing some of the larger institutions that are economic engines for the city? So I think it's really about finding more comprehensive ways for government to respond to the needs of our arts sector.
We have a lot of hands, so maybe a quick answer to the second question.
Yeah, for small theaters, I would say contact your local council member, right? It's really hard to get the attention of the mayor. It's really hard to get the attention of the speaker. Your council member is in your neighborhood, right? He can do a walkthrough of your space. He can start with small investments, whether it's like $10,000 to $15,000, and then eventually that can become much bigger as people know the work you're doing, and it can lead to bigger sums of money. The perfect example locally is ABC No Real. It's been a barren ground for decades. I knew it as a kid as the scary place. I used to run really quickly because it was a place of like anarchists, you know, social justice, rock music, grunge music. But when I talked to the people who went there and the work they did, I realized that it was a transformative space that was so Lower East Side, and we had to bring it back. And the first capital project I really invested in was rebuilding that space, and it's going to open now later this year. And so,
which is no. I think to be fair, to be very specific, there is a difference. Your point, Norah, of being a cultural playground for the rich and being a cultural capital city. And those two things are not the same. They may have the same word in them, but they're not the same. And all of this is linked because one of the things that prices out many of our cultural institutions, especially smaller cultural institutions, is the physical space cost. Whether you own it or rent it, small businesses, which arts institutions are small businesses, even though sometimes we don't treat them that way, are all being priced out of the city, just like we are as residents. So these things are very much connected.
Let's see, is this working? Is this working now? Okay, you go.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having this really wonderful conversation. As I was hearing you guys speak, you were talking a lot about the community and government and the city and the federal government. But really what I'm not hearing is the real things that are happening, the things that we're not seeing. And it has to do with the players that are not public, real estate, for example, who really put, millions of dollars into making sure that affordable housing is not possible, buying out politicians. We saw a lot of corruption in the Abrons administration. And so I think it would be really helpful to point out players that we don't see publicly that are causing this issue. Because if we're not talking about them, we're not really exposing the things that are happening, and we're continuing to put Band-Aids on the issues that we have in this society. Thank you so much.
I'll take it. Yeah? Okay. All right. So I think you lift up a good point. I want to maybe like a slight differentiation between corruption and being a massive power player. And I think I think of them as like juggernauts. Everywhere has a power juggernaut, right? If you're in Detroit, Michigan, it's auto. If you're in parts of Texas, it's oil. Here in New York City, it's real estate. And different flavor for different folks. That doesn't mean we can't win. Maybe it takes time. That's why I say come back to patience, right? It takes work, but 2019 renting changes to the rent laws at the state level was 25 years worth of organizing and advocacy work. We got our butt kicked for years before we started to actually swing that pendulum back and win. And so part of it is like, it really stinks to say, but like one of the hard things, and I'm a kid out of family from the civil rights movement, wins and losses may not be about me. I may not be there for them. I may not be in this seat anymore, right? It's that we are like building and putting the bricks in place so that someday somebody will win the thing, and then the next person will be building on their bricks, and we just keep on going. We keep on trucking, right? And it's not happy, but that's what movement work is, and that's what I come back to.
I just want to add one point. The real estate industry is actually pretty visible, is knowing how to identify them. We see them through political campaigns. You're going to get political mailers starting probably the next few weeks. In the bottom portion of that mailer is going to say paid for by. And sometimes it says for supporting low-income New Yorkers, or for, fixing the affordability crisis. Google what those entities are. And what you'll find is that that's big real estate creating a PAC, a political action committee, to influence our politics and influence who elects us. And so that's the clearest way to identify how probably your neighborhood is going to look in the next 10 years, and depending on which candidate wins because of those influences. But also show up to your community board, show up to city council hearings. Every single month, developers are going to community board meetings. And whether, I have a intense relationship with my community board at times because they are making decisions that I don't agree with, and sometimes I'm making decisions that they don't agree with. But the players are there, and they're trying to show you what they want to do. It's whether we have the people in that community board that are going to hold those developers accountable, or reject, or organize their council members to say no to those projects. And so there is mostly just identifying them and knowing where they show up and pushing back at those meetings.
I want to point out that kind of power is easiest to exercise when it's invisible. And it works best because it can be invisible. The rent laws almost got killed in 1997 under George Pataki. One of the only things that saved them was the tenant movement got word to reporters about the fact that Bruno, the Republican, upstate, doesn't have a single regulated, he's going to promise, I can't remember if it was REBNY or the Real Estate Rent Stabilization Association, which is the largest landlord group. But because that got into the newspapers, it made it possible for the tenants to mobilize, right? And then years and years later, when the 2019 law is coming down the pike, the landlords who had pretty good access to the governor at that time, Andrew Cuomo, call and say, can you do anything about this? And he says, sorry, the game is up, Why? Because people had built the power, right, to combat power that oftentimes thrived because it was unseen.
Hello, thank you everyone for being here. My name is Leon. I really like the idea of looking to see what new initiatives can help people keep the money they have in their pockets as much as possible. People don't have the freedom to pay for everything they want. They have to hope they have enough for what they need, which is why it's great to see people talking about free groceries and free buses and things like that. But there are also existing initiatives that are here that people don't know about, that don't take advantage of. I'm biased because I'm the executive director of the House of Good Deeds, and we have the support of the council member on stage, but we're not just for poor people or homeless people. We serve free food, free housewares. We run Manhattan's largest free store 3 minutes away from here on Houston and Avenue D. And I'd like to know why there isn't more being done to publicize what already exists and do more to support organizations like the House of Good Deeds rather than try to hope we can push through new initiatives.
I think that's a really good point. And how do I want to honestly answer that? Sometimes I think because, first of all, we need to pay our nonprofits. I don't know that we said that, right? I thought one of you guys were going to say that earlier. And for some reason, it's just been okay not to pay them. I also think that oftentimes people just are like, I'm going to start a new profit. I'm going to do this. And we lose sight of what is really working and why a program like yours that's probably excellent and that people need to know about, why do we not spend time also just talking about those programs, but everybody wants to start something new? I don't know the answer to that. Maybe it goes back to the question about the ego or needs or little tiny things. I think we've got to work better together across nonprofits. We have to publicize each other because everybody does not do everything well. And how do we look at a community and say, who's doing this part and who's doing this other part? Again, it's why I love settlement houses and things of that sort, because they actually do kind of point you in the right directions if they don't have it. But I think you make an excellent point about why don't we use the things that we have and that are good and are of high quality in communities.
I'll also add just one piece, which is I think looking at some other places either across the U.S. and other major cities in other countries. One thing we don't do very well as city government, and city government has a role to play in this, is tell people when we've done something. Like, we have massive undersubscription in senior assistance for rent, and it's because we have this bill, and it's been around for a long time, and we have never been like, we're going to put on every billboard and every bus station so that every single senior knows. We very oddly like put these big initiatives in and then actually don't prioritize and invest in like telling you could be like, everybody in this area needs to know about you guys, and everybody in this area needs to know about this other thing. And it's just a strange thing that is not a focus point for us here.
And I have to uplift Anne's point as well, because collaboration is everything. To your earlier point, there is a spectrum of different cultural institutions in this city. We advocate collectively. You have the Met on the City Hall steps right next to the really small local dance theater, right? We are advocating as a sector to be able to have baseline funding. That's not just for the large institutions, that's for the entire agency, and how that gets split is based on our government, right? So I think to that point, it's so important that we capitalize on what already exists and learn how to work across the line and advocate together and galvanize that energy. And to one of the earlier points, also create your own PAC. Right, I do think like some of the library just created a PAC, like the 3 library systems in the city. There's opportunity here to also push back through their own games.
Thank you. One more question over here, and then I'll get to the ones on the other side.
Hi. I have a question about how, as a citizen, someone outside of an institution, sort of how and where to join the fight. Barika, you've talked a lot tonight about when it's important to join the fight when you feel like you're losing year over year over year. And then when there is a moment where the door cracks open, to push really hard there. So I think I'm curious in sort of 2 different directions. One being, like, what are the losing fights that it's important to join now? Even though they feel like they're hopeless, and I know it's kind of all of them, but where specifically would you recommend putting your energies? And what are the particular issues or areas that right now feel like the door is cracking open and you should run there and help push hard?
I'm going to give an answer that you're maybe not going to be satisfied with, and that's because I'm going to say it doesn't, sort of my answer is it doesn't matter. I don't as a person who housing is my love language, it shows me I didn't choose it. I've tried to get away from it different times in my career. It never works. Find your thing. For me, I don't care if you're involved in my issue. I care if you find the thing to be involved in and then be involved. Because when it's time to have a housing transit fight, we're going to come find you. And then we'll be working together, right? I was asked one of the questions at the mayoral debate for the cultural institution, so I know exactly that we were at BRIC, right? So we will sync up together. The point is, don't try to worry about the perfect. If you want to do neighborhood-based, find the thing here in your neighborhood. If you want to focus on childcare, find the childcare. Just find the thing, and then start to navigate from there. Right? And if for some reason it's like, this doesn't quite speak to me, I don't love the way they flow, then just go to the next one. They're all a little different. I got 85 members. Everybody's a special different flower. They're amazing. But they're very different. We've got 2 people and we've got people who have 4,000 staff. Entirely different folks. Just find the thing and get started. It's also one of the most rewarding things ever. Like, I know more of my name. Mr. Leslie's like, I got to fill out my form. And I was like, okay, we're going to sit down and fill out your form. And this all came from a community board meeting. And he was like, you're on my block. I don't know how to do this. And I said, okay, I will help you do it. And lo and behold, I have been doing this forum for 5 years.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Jennifer. I'm a movement person, also a media person. I most recently, in the last couple of years, I've been organizing with Jews for Racial and Economic Justice. One of our two big campaigns this year is around pressuring Hochul to tax the rich, to in conjunction with having organized to get the mayor in office so that we would have better conditions under which to organize in the future. Now we have those conditions citywide. Statewide seems to be shifting a tiny bit, as you mentioned, with the pied-à-terre tax. What I'm interested in, both Barika and everybody else who wants to weigh in, what is in your vision in various sectors, whether it's the arts sector, whether it's housing, whether it's childcare, elder care, community care, what are the different ways that various institutions and people in movements can pressure Hochul? We have our ways, but taxing the rich, it's what you were saying about Paris, right? The pied-à-terre tax in Paris. We don't even need to go all the way to Paris. We shouldn't just go to New Jersey, and they already tax the rich more than we do here. Nobody's left New Jersey. We're not going to leave New York. The billionaires are not going to leave here. So I'm just interested. That's one of the biggest shifts locally in years is this growing pressure to tax the rich, but we haven't discussed it much in this context, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
You know, the state is always harder because it's almost abstract, right? It's so far away. There's a lot of assembly members. There's a little bit less state senators, a handful of state senators, and then there's a governor that you feel like is like the Wizard of Oz, right? Like they're running this massive state and they're making all these big announcements, and so sometimes it just feels like you're taking on Goliath, right? And the city is different because you can walk down to City Hall and, scream at the mayor when he's coming out of City Hall and, ask him a question, or council members, or walk into their office. And I think this is where collective action is really important, especially in the state. And that's why what Barika said earlier is that all these different sectors coming together, especially now when you look at some of the climate action to stop our governor from not implementing the laws that were passed previously, historic climate change legislation, which would improve the lives of everybody and our future generation. And when you look at who's rallying up there, it's just not climate activists, it's housing activists, it's people with disabilities. They're all coming together because they all understand that if we allow the governor to weaken one law, then she can weaken almost every other law. And I think this mentality is kind of unique to Albany because it's so big and so vast that we need to have that collective action. And I think that's why we've seen, the rent reforms. That's why we've seen kind of every single year blockbuster legislation being passed, is because activists realize that we have to fight together because there's many special interests and wealthier special interests on the other side. And so I think advocates and organizers have found the playbook. We don't know what the next fight is going to be, but we are ready as a group to take on anything that comes towards us.
I just want to point out, this is possible in a way that it has not been for many decades in New York State politics. Like, I don't think people fully understand how much of a rupture that realignment in 2018 was. Like, the city, New York City, was disempowered structurally at the state level by the fact that the state Senate was constitutionally Republican, as Al Smith used to say, right? It's not anymore. That means you can put pressure on elected officials in a way that could redound really powerfully at the state level in a way that just was not true from 1970 through 2018.
And just for background on that, previously we had a group of Democratic state senators called the IDC who would caucus with Republicans to give them the majority. And these 8 Democrats were really good friends with former Governor Andrew Cuomo, and they had a partnership. If they aligned with the Republicans, they would be able to pass legislation, bring money back to their district. And so even though we were a Democratic, state, and every single big city has a super majority of Democrats, we're controlled by Republicans because this really small group of individuals just shifted to work with Republicans. And that broke in 2018, which has led to all these reforms coming out ever since then.
I think we have one more question. Do we have time for two or one?
Hi, I'm Kylie, and so my question was primarily for Mason B. Williams, but if any of you guys have a take on the question, feel more than free to jump in. So I wanted to ask you this because of your background and profession being a historian, and you know the prior success of the city regarding affordability throughout the decades. So what do you think would be the best approach for the youth in the matter, especially in areas with high recidivism, in order to aid their communities in the matter?
Can I ask you just to repeat the last part of the question again, just to make sure I got it?
I wanted to know, like, what would be the best approach for youth to aid their communities, especially with high recidivism in the matter of housing affordability?
Great. Thank you so much for the question. I think the fact that you're asking what can be done means you've already taken the first step. I think one of the sort of undertones of this entire conversation has been that really important, difficult change comes ultimately in some profound way from the bottom up. And that it is people who are organizing, who are working together, who are finding ways to work together, even if they maybe don't see eye to eye all the time, is really important. I think that understanding all these problems that we're talking about as being interconnected is really important. That there is no such thing as like just a schools problem that's separate from the housing problem, that's separate from the general kind of economic structure. Like these things are all connected. And to not sort of like break off one piece of it and think that you can just address that, right? Think about how to, I was thinking about something Barika said in response to an earlier question about what it means to win, right? I teach college students and they all want to know, how do I succeed at something? And I think two things are true at once, and they sound contradictory, but you got to keep them both in mind and think about how they could work together. I teach this Intro to Leadership Studies class at Williams, and every fall I teach Saul Alinsky's Rules for Radicals. And one of the things that he's very intent on is make sure you pick some battles that you can win, because that's going to make people feel empowered, right? If I can win this, then maybe I can win something bigger. If you just start with the biggest thing, it seems like it's just too big a thing to ask, and like, why would you? You're going to lose, and it becomes demobilizing. So you do want to think about that, right? Like, how am I going to achieve some things and show that like the system can be changed? Think about that. But at the same time, the nature of trying to do big, important change is that you're going to lose more often than you're going to win. And so that's why it's so important not to think about like this is just being results oriented. Results really matter. Of course they really matter. Like we want to improve people's lives and we want to improve our city, right? But the nature of it again is that if you're fighting people who are some incumbent power structure, like they're powerful. So just ask yourself, like, why do you really want to do this? Yeah, you want to make people's lives better and you want to make your city better, but what you want to do is just do the right thing, right? This is like, to quote Frederick Douglass, it's soul ennobling work that you're proposing to do, right? And if you keep that in mind, right, and you're strategic, but you also remember what your sense of mission is, why this chose you, as Barika said. I think that's maybe a start.
It's one amazing question. I think to Mason's point, like we thinking about the Alinsky model, the long term, the transformative work. If I think about for myself, Black liberation for women, I'm not gonna see that in my lifetime. I'm not. So the win is not gonna happen for me. I don't expect to see the win. but I expect to win, and I'm always going to do the fight. The win is being in the fight. The win is not like, I will get there, because she's fighting this fight for her grandkids, right? Like that's where we're all headed. The other thing I think is important for youth is like, sometimes you're right and we're wrong, and sometimes it's okay to say that. Most of the movement, most of the energy, most of the like push in civil rights movements often come from the youth, right? And it's important to learn the history and to talk to people and sit and be in space and like, like respectability politics and like listen to your elders, all that. But also like, sometimes y'all are right and we're wrong. And it's okay to be like, tell me why it's not possible, but why, but why, but why, and then be like, but I'm still gonna go for it. And sometimes that's what actually gets us to winning, as opposed to us up here being like, well, in 1947, it was blah, 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 and this is the reason why it didn't happen. That's what a lot of us will do, and the answer is, it doesn't matter. I think you say, I think we can win it now, me and my folks think we can win it now, then go for it.
Did we have one? Okay, great. One more question. Yeah, sure. Yes.
Hi, yes, quick question. So my name is Clement, and so what you have talked about with affordability, how that's affecting New York in general, and also specifically the disability community, and especially NYCHA. There are so many complaints with accessibility. Fire alarms are not working, which is unsafe. Many things need to be repaired, and it's not happening. And so recently I had a discussion with MOPD, the Mayor's Office for People with Disabilities, and discussed how this is such a large issue and really highly impacting the deaf community, and how we need to enforce change and see improvement. And just had an open discussion with them, and it was a good conversation, and I'm just generally interested in what you think about that, or what your perspective is on all of that.
I mean, I love the question. Also, kudos, applause to our sign language interpreters, because that's hard work. I think one of the things that we are looking and seeing already is some interest from this administration to take a tackle at something that is one of the least like sexy housing topics, which is code enforcement, which hits all of our everyday lives of like, my elevator doesn't work, there's a leak in my roof, our stairs are falling down, there's no ramp anymore. All of these things are like tangible things, and they're things that a lot of times people don't want to tackle because it's not a big ribbon cutting and it's not new units, but it is our lives, right? And I think there's some real interest from this administration now to say like, no, code enforcement is a livability issue. And so thinking about how we ensure that the units that we have in our city are actually functioning for everybody in the way that they are required to operate, so that they are accessible, available, livable, functional for all of their various residents. I will say one piece for NYCHA that is always a challenge is NYCHA basically operates as its own independent system. So I can pull 311 data on every single building in New York City. I can know where there are violations. I can know how many complaints are happening. I can know whether or not they had a fire. We can do none of that with NYCHA. It is its own internal loop. We don't know anything about it. It does not report into the 311 system, interestingly. And so that is this, like, when you talk about visibility and transparency, NYCHA has a big transparency problem because actually, we as a community don't have the same like accessibility and visibility into what is happening in NYCHA most of the time.
I think we're out of time, but there is going to be a reception, so we invite everyone to join us there. And please join me in thanking our remarkable panelists for this wonderful conversation.